Web Marketing That Works podcast, episode 65, and it's a solo show today from me, Adam, on how to invite influencers onto your podcast.
Welcome to the Web Marketing That Works podcast. Come behind the scenes of real-life marketing experiments and listen in as amazing guests confess the truth about what really works. Now, here are your hosts, Adam Franklin and Toby Jenkins.
I'm Adam Franklin, and you are listening to the Web Marketing That Works podcast, the show for people who love marketing on the web. You'll be taken behind the scenes of real-life marketing experiments. We'll look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll confess what's failed and reveal the truth about what really works. This podcast is brought to you by our book, which is called Web Marketing That Works, and you can get your hands on the 33 free marketing templates that go with it at bluewiremedia.com.au/book. That's bluewiremedia.com.au/book, in case I spoke too quickly on that URL just then. Okay, so we're doing a solo show today. I'm getting back into the swing of those. They're just short 5 to 10 minute shows. And the question I've been asked this week is, how do you invite influencers onto your podcast? And I want to take you through a couple of the things that I do, and it's had a reasonably good success rate. And again, you never really fail. The worst that can happen is just get a bit of silence on the other end, in which case you can just revisit that in a few months' time or a year's time, once you've maybe delivered a bit more value to the person, maybe they've got a bit less on their plate. But let me take you through some of the things that I do well before I would actually ask anybody onto the show. The first thing I'd do is subscribe to their podcast and subscribe to their blog. So the reason for this is to get a real good feel for, one, whether I even want them on the show, but secondly, to really get familiar with their work. So typically when I'm going for a run, for example, or maybe commuting, I'll actually be listening to certain podcasts with a view potentially to one day inviting either the host or the guest onto this podcast. Additionally, I'll have my Feedly feed on my phone so that if I'm ever just waiting for a meeting or waiting to board a plane or something, I can just quickly open that up and just browse through the type of content that these influencers are creating. And again, to see if I like what they're talking about, and to whether I think there's a good angle or a good opportunity to ask them questions about stuff that's going to be valuable to you, our listener. The next thing I would do is then subscribe to their email list. Nearly every single person, at least in marketing, will have an email list. So I'll just head to their website and subscribe to their newsletter. And that way, they're having delivered their emails every week into my inbox. So I can, again, just gradually build up the knowledge that I've got of this person and their content. So after a while of subscribing to their email list, I would occasionally maybe hit reply to that, particularly if they have said something that particularly resonated with me. But more about that in a sec when we talk about the actual process of reaching out to the influencer. The other things that I'll do is follow them on Twitter and check to see if they're on Instagram, and then very lightly just start to retweet articles of theirs that you found particularly useful, or maybe take it. What I like to do, it's a bit cheesy, but often if I'm reading their book, I will just take a photograph on Instagram with a bit of the background of where I'm actually reading it, say it's at the beach or the pool or wherever, and just mention them in the Instagram caption, just to let them know that I'm enjoying their book and whereabouts in the world I'm actually reading it. That very often gets a response from the author, if they're an influencer that happens to have written a book. Okay, so that's all the prep work that I'll do. And then it comes to the scary part, which is actually reaching out to them. And the reason I say it's scary, anybody can send an email. It's not literally sending the email that's scary. It's that fear of rejection. It's that, essentially, fear of the unknown. They might say no. They might not write back to you. And that is the confronting part for a lot of us. And I totally get it. But if you do all that prep work, it makes it a lot more likely that you're going to get a response. So one of the easiest things you can actually do in order to strike up a conversation And this is well before, again, you actually make the ask. You don't invite them on the podcast in your first interaction. What you do is you listen to their podcast, you read their emails and you read their blog. And what you're looking for is calls to action from them where you can actually reply. For example, I know on some podcasts they'll say, all right, now if you're on Instagram, take a photograph of where you're listening to the podcast from. And so it's a great opportunity if the host of the show has actually said, take a photograph of where you're at, then that's exactly what you can do because they're expecting that and they've asked you to do it. Additionally, like if you're receiving an email from somebody and they say, hit reply and let us know what your goals are for 2015, or hit reply and let us know X, Y, and Z. That's a perfect opportunity to reply and say, hey, Mr. Influencer, here's what I'm up to. Thanks for asking. How's everything in your world? Because you are then proving that you're an active, engaged member of their community, and that's what they're trying to cultivate. So they're always going to be much more open-minded and much more accepting of people from within their community rather than just some outsider who just happens to hit them up for a podcast, because they get hit up all the time and they've got to somehow decide who is going to be worthwhile chatting to out of all of the hundreds of requests that they get. So if you're part of their community, then they're much more likely to give you the thumbs up. So doing that is a great way of being responsive and attentive to what they're asking for. If there hasn't been necessarily an opportunity to reply to one of their calls to action, a really great way to do it is to be generous to them and help spread their message to the people in your audience. Now again, we're not going to have the same numbers of people that are listening to us and getting our emails and following us on Twitter as they are. So don't necessarily frame it as, oh wow, I'm going to send it to 150 Twitter followers, so you really better pay attention. But it's just the act of being generous and thinking about them and thinking about putting their message first as opposed to your own goals and desires. So a good example of that might be, dear Mr. Influencer, I read your blog post on X, Y, and Z, and it really resonated with me because I had this experience. And don't give them your entire life story. Keep it to a couple of sentences max. You don't want to make it so long that they don't even bother reading it and just hit delete. That would defeat the whole purpose. But let them know, for example, how it's impacted you. Additionally, if they've got, say, a book or a program or something coming up, particularly a book, you could say, Mr. Influencer, look, I've just ordered your book. And you've got to actually order it. You've got to be sincere and authentic with this. Buy their book and then say, hey, I've bought it. I'm looking forward to it arriving, or I've downloaded it on Kindle. I'm going to get stuck into it tonight. I look forward to it. Or I've just finished your book, or I'm halfway through it. It's really great. I think my audience might like certain aspects of it. Have you got any tips for fans of the book like me to help promote it to the people that follow us? So again, you're offering to help them spread their message to a new audience. And even if your audience isn't massive, the intention that counts and it's the thought that counts, and the influencer will very often go, oh wow, that's really kind of you. Look, I would love it if you did a X, Y, and Z. Maybe it's a Amazon review, maybe it's a podcast review on iTunes. But little things, no matter how small your audience, there are little things that you can do that are generous and helpful to these influencers. Okay, so the final piece of the puzzle is once you've initiated the conversation, ideally they write back, maybe they don't. If they don't, that's cool, no stress. They get hundreds of emails every hour. Wait for another time when an article or a blog or a podcast resonates or there's another call to action. If they do reply, that's wonderful. Don't then smother them with a lifelong story of your life history. Again, just keep it short, keep it meaningful. Maybe have one or two exchanges. You don't want to beat around the bush and just sort of spend 20 emails before you actually make the ask, but just make sure that there's a bit of interaction, a bit of genuine appreciation and genuine gratitude for what they've been sharing and how they've helped you. And very often the influencers will say, hey, I'm glad you liked it. Is there anything I can do for you? Or when are you going to help? Are you going to spread my word to your audience? And that's a great opportunity to then say, yeah, look, that's a great idea. I mean, I've got a podcast. Maybe I can talk to you, hear it straight from the horse's mouth and share that podcast with my audience. So that's great if they instigate, some sort of reciprocity. But if they don't, the final thing to do is just say, hey, look, Mr. Influencer, I've really enjoyed your blog post, your podcast. I'm an aspiring podcaster, blogger, etc., etc. I would love it if I could interview you. I've got a couple of questions I'd really like to ask. I don't think you've answered them before. If you've got 10 spare minutes, at a time that's convenient to you, I'd love to invite you as a guest on my show. Depending on how far up the food chain, so to speak, they are. I'm in Australia, as you may be able to tell from my accent, but a lot of the people that I like to interview are in the States. And of course, the time zones just do not align very well. So I'll often add, if it's just 5 or 10 minutes, if it's in the middle of the day for you, I'm happy to get up at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, whatever it takes. I just really love to ask you a couple of questions and then leave it at that. And I always make sure to say, look, if you're too busy, that's fine too. I totally get it. But really just wanted to ask. And so that is my approach for inviting influencers or guests onto the show. It's had a pretty good strike rate so far. I hope you find that useful. If you do have any stories of your own, please drop me a line, drop me a tweet. My Twitter is @Franklin_Adam. My email is adam.franklin@bluewiremedia.com.au. My intent is to deliver actionable advice on this podcast, so your feedback and questions are always appreciated. I've just given you my email address, so drop me a line. And if you enjoyed the show, and I hope you did, it would be fantastic if you could take a couple of minutes to leave us an honest review on iTunes. Thanks for listening to the end, and I'll see you on the next show. Cheers.